Welcome to the New Testament Theologist YouTube channel. I'm Nick, and hello. And if this is your first time here, this is basically the place you come to get a lot of biblical, theological, and exegetical content from someone who is a absolute New Testament nerd. So if this is your first time here, welcome. A lot of this may not make a lot of sense to you. There's a ton of videos, well, not a ton of videos. There's a bunch of videos previously that I go through Romans, give kind of hermeneutical or interpretive issues there. There's tons of other videos on the channel for that. So if this is your first time here, welcome. Happy you're here. I would pause this though and go and watch the other videos. But for those who are regulars here, welcome back, and apologies for the time it took to get this to you. It was it's been a week. We'll leave it at that. It's been a week. Wow, what a week it's been. But thankfully we're here. We have a few interviews that are being recorded that'll probably come out in the next, once you see this video, probably in the next half week or so. I'm really excited for those interviews. If you want to know who they are, you can go watch the Loose Leaf Homilies, the most recent one from last Sunday. And if, of course, that's of interest to you. If you want to be surprised, then there you go. You can be surprised. But two really awesome New Testament nerds are coming on, experts in their field, to talk about stuff that I think is really important, both for the academy and, I think, more importantly, for the church. So we'll be going through that. Make sure you comment and like this video, because without that sort of thing, these videos tend to languish. I mean, that's kind of the name of the game in YouTube land is if you want the algorithm to like your video, you need to have lots of comments, lots of positive comments, and lots of likes and all that sort of stuff. So if you're watching this now, make sure to comment, like, subscribe, do all those sorts of things. And if you like what you see here, share the video or the playlist on your social media. That's a great way to get this small channel boosted. Certain YouTubers have hit 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. It's like, boy, that'd be really cool to get there someday. But God is in control, God is love, and we'll see what happens. So moving on, we're going through the text of Romans, and we're in chapter 8, and we're talking about verses 18 through 27. The longest video I think I've ever done is, oh goodness, it was over 2 hours, like 2 hours, 10 minutes or something like that, which is an incredible amount of time to dedicate to a specific topic. This video might go a little longer. So the script is very in-depth. It's very, well, if you're a patron and you want to be a patron and support this little channel, become one. Or if you want the script, just email me and I'll happily send it to you. But it took me a while to do my translation. As you will see, there's a couple textual issues that are really difficult to go through. So let's just dive into this. Let's just do it. We'll save this housekeeping stuff for the end, but make sure you like, share, subscribe, do all that sort of stuff. And that's the way the channel gets anywhere on the social media channels and stuff. So translation. So here's the translation I have for Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 27. There it is. For I think that the sufferings of the present critical time are not worth comparing with the coming glory to be disclosed to us. For the created realm waits with anticipation for the revelation of the sons of God. For creation was subjected unto futility, not by its own free will, but through the one who subjected it, in hope, because even creation itself will be emancipated from the enslavement of corruption for the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that all creation joins in lament together in the agony of childbirth together, until now. Not only this, but even we, the firstfruits of those who possess the Spirit, also lament among ourselves, anticipating the liberation of our bodies. For with this hope we were saved, or delivered. I've gone back and forth on that. But hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what they have not seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we anticipate it because of our perseverance, or because of perseverance. In the same way also, the Spirit supports us in our frailty, for we do not know what we should pray for, but the Spirit itself intercedes with laments that are inexpressible. And the one searching hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes on behalf of the saints in accordance with God. So there's a lot there. Some translational choices you may have noticed, some you may have not, and some you may not care about. And some may have you pounding the table or desk or wherever you're working or watching this, but that is the translation, and I always say this, or I try to always say this, I reserve the right to go back and change my mind. Translation is it's a messy business sometimes, but we are here, we are doing this. So Paul has spent a great deal of time on the kind of contrastive life between the eschatological kind of present corruption of those in Adam, that's Romans 7, or at least how I read Romans 7, and on apocalyptic new life for those in Christ. And so Paul has kind of affirmed the sovereignty of the Spirit and the participatory nature of human agency in response to the Spirit. So there's kind of a reciprocal reality that kind of seems to operate with the Spirit. The Spirit doesn't seem content to be a bully, we might say. I don't think that a lot of what we see in Romans 8 is often interpreted as a contradiction, essentially what it boils down to, kind of the parallel lines meeting in eternity, to kind of paraphrase a phrase I've heard before and didn't bother to go track down because it's just a phrase we all know now, kind of, if you're at least familiar in certain circles. But I think the point is that the sovereignty of the Spirit is kind of at the heart of what is framing this initiatory and invasive and liberation that the Spirit offers. And it's offered to all who are in darkness. And so the response of the human person is to be seen kind of in light of what the Spirit has done for us, but not as mechanistically determined by the Spirit. That is, the Spirit doesn't seem intent on determining things for us. Rather, the Spirit seems to intercede and work with us and alongside us in a way that does not suggest kind of coercion or a sort of any sort of thing like that. And so, as such, I think Paul has kind of affirmed that what we would call prevenient apocalyptic activity of the triune God in human history. Acting contra sin and the powers of death. So sin and death and these various powers and entities have responded negatively to God and have kind of wrested control of God's good creation and have kind of seized it for themselves. They've kind of invaded or basically usurped the sovereignty of God. And God's kind of work is to kind of reinvade the cosmos and the incarnation, to reestablish his kingdom and to establish his lordship over all things in response to the principalities and the powers and even, as we'll see, death itself. And so I think this is all kind of a major setup for what follows in the infamous kind of Romans 9 through 11. But we often kind of view Romans 8 as kind of a nice little thing, but it doesn't really have a lot to say to Romans 9 through 11. And I think that's just not the right way to read Romans as a whole. But you're going to miss a lot of stuff in Romans 9. Because I don't think Paul suddenly changes his mind on stuff as he keeps going. I think Paul has kind of a consistent vision for how he articulates and understands the spirited life, the Christian life. And so it also brings up the question of the character of God. So the character of God in Romans 9 through 11 is kind of what I think Paul is disputing, or at least sees people as disputing or people thinking about. And I think that's vital to Romans 8 specifically. What is the character of the God we now worship? What is the character of the Spirit? Who is the Spirit and what does the Spirit do for us? Not in kind of a, what do you give me, but what does the Spirit do? And so you'll notice that I stopped at Romans 8:27, so I could leave Romans 28, 29, and 30 for the next video, which will be much longer, or probably not much longer, but it'll be a very substantial video because there's a lot of Greek grammar you got to deal with. There's some intertextual stuff you got to deal with, and let's face it, everyone argues about a verse. When everyone decides to argue about a certain verse, then you got to tackle basically every aspect of it, and that's just how it goes in nerdy academia land. And so, but just so you know, I don't see a division between verse 27 and verse 28. I think they all speak together. But just for the sake of keeping the video manageable, I've left those 3 verses off for next time. And so let's begin at the beginning of our section in Romans 8:18, and I'll read the verse again. For I think that the sufferings of the present critical time are not worth comparing with the coming glory to be disclosed to us. And so Paul has already used the phrase, or rather the verb logizomai, which often is to reckon or to consider or to think. It's used all throughout Romans already. Romans 2:3, Romans 2:26, all of Romans 4. It's all over the place. Romans 3:28. And here he's kind of presenting his kind of rhetorical assessment of what has been kind of previously established. But there's kind of a different aspect to it here. So kind of based on the fall of the Adamic realm, or the falling of the Adamic realm, and kind of the Christological invasion, Paul is speaking of kind of his own worldview here. So in light of everything that has been talked about in Romans 7, well, all of Romans, but specifically Romans 7, and the immediate verses preceding this, he's kind of reasserting his worldview, or his epistemological understanding of how things work and what God expects of us. And so this point he's asserting is based on what the apocalyptic Son, Jesus Christ, has done and is doing in, with, and through those who participate in this new life. Porter actually, in his commentary on Romans, speaks of logizomai as in terms of, say, calculation, making a calculation, whether that's in terms of rhetoric or in terms of conclusions, or in terms of economics or interpersonal relationships, or the sort. So you can see there's a lot kind of compacted there, but I think Paul's kind of having weighed the options, if I can be paraphrastic, having weighed the options, having considered things, here's now what I think based on what I've seen and what I've thought. And so co-suffering and co-glorification with Christ, as we saw last video, have produced a new paradigm, or rather the whole Christ event has produced a new paradigm. But in terms of his rhetoric or his discourse, his worldview now is shaped by the suffering of the crucified Messiah and the seismic activity of the Holy Spirit. These two things have now begun to shape his worldview in a very articulate and intense way. So, for example, having begun the work of, quote, putting to death the exploits of the body, Romans 8:13, with the Spirit, one has to ask and consider the role of suffering as it relates to God's eschatological war against death. So as Richard Longnecker has helpfully stated, quote, this expression functions in an epistolary fashion to highlight Paul's own conviction. These are Paul's convictions, or his understanding of all of this, end quote. I would affirm this, but I think I would press it further into the realm of worldview. I'm a big fan of that kind of idea there, which can, I think, accommodate Longnecker's proposal. And so that is why logizomai is so important, because it's not as if Paul's just kind of saying something. He's being intentional with what he's attempting to communicate. And so the lexeme pathema is used throughout the Pauline corpus to describe physical anguish and suffering, including, say, the suffering of Christ, 2 Corinthians 1:5. It's also used, and it's tied often to the believer's suffering with Christ, in Galatians 5:24, Philippians, I think it's 3:10, Colossians 1:24. So the sufferings or the anguish of all of this kind of present reality is kind of at the forefront of this lexeme. This word is used in 4 Maccabees to denote emotions and to assert, and they assert that God is the creator of human emotion in 4 Maccabees 2:21, and other instances in 4th Maccabees. And 4th Maccabees is a Jewish historical work focusing on the Maccabean revolt and the war that happened. The event happened probably 200 years, give or take, before the time of the New Testament, give or take, from 167. So, 200 years-ish. Not a math pod. But 4th Maccabees is important, and they also, just in terms of understanding the New Testament, because it's close to that time, and they suggest that reason and emotion can often be opposed to one another, and that's in 4th Maccabees 6:32 through 33. And so this kind of emotional state, these sufferings, has kind of a clarifying impact on one's worldview, right? It kind of gives us a suggestion that suffering is a universal reality that impacts all people. And so it's part and parcel of the human condition. But it also suggests that even in our emotions, there is a sense in which that, as we'll see, that longing, that groaning, that anticipation is fixed on the idea that the good God gave us good things, and those good things have become corrupted over time. And I think that's important because it helps us kind of refocus mental health and spirituality and see things as maybe these things are good that we've shirked off, or we've misinterpreted, or we've treated like common currency, or something like that perhaps. But I think we often kind of respond to things in our own cultural way without understanding the biblical background of these things. And so suffering, maybe saying it this way, suffering has a way of kind of wiping the glass clean, wipe it clean, so that one can see through it perfectly rather than, say, dimly. And maybe there's another way of saying this as well, is you cannot buy your way out of suffering. No money in the world is going to prevent any suffering on your part, or on the part of those you love, or even those you hate. You can't vote your way out of suffering, or anything. It's part and parcel of the human condition. And being in Christ, does not absolve one of sufferings and anguish in this life. And while this is not a new idea for Paul, I think it takes on a whole new understanding for him in this kind of apocalyptic reality. We expect suffering because there are bad things in the world, and these things run contrary to the good God of all creation. There are things at war with God. There are things that God does not like that are in God's world, doing things that God doesn't want. And that's why legizomai and pathema and these words are so important, because they communicate who God is in relation to the world. And you don't want to kind of cross-contaminate the idea of suffering and determinism and all these sorts of things with what Scripture seems to say right here is God doesn't really impose these sorts of things, at least in the sense that we can attribute them to sin and death and Satan and the powers and Caesar and so on and so forth. And so the phrase, the present time, or the present critical time, tu nun kairu, is really intriguing, actually. I did a deep dive on this one. Time is a big component of apocalyptic thought, of apocalyptic literature, how apocalyptic thinkers in the Jewish world kind of conceptualized of reality. It relates to, time relates to the different ages, specifically this age or the age to come, or this present evil age versus the coming age, and God's kind of eschatological judgment. And so judgment is often a part of it, although not always. And you see this kind of tied into kind of Jewish literature. You see, for example, Wisdom of Solomon ties this concept, time, to death. Quote, "For our allotted time is the passing of a shadow, and there is no return from our death, because it is sealed up and no one turns back." And that's Wisdom of Solomon 2:15 or 2:5 in the NRSV. Sirach 123 uses a specific idiom, heos kairu, until the time, or maybe colloquially till the end, perhaps, if you want to interpret it that way, denoting a specific point within time that comes to an end, marking a shift. And then Sirach, again in 420, frames the issue this way, quote, "Watch for the opportune time and beware of evil, and do not be ashamed to be yourself." Again from the NRSV. I just realized I didn't say this. All translations from Romans are mine. Anything else from Jewish literature may be mine, but I'll clarify if it is or it isn't, or I'll try to. It is in the document, or the thing I post. And then Daniel 12:9 uses that same idiom that Sirach just used in 420, the heos kairu, until the time. And it's in relation to kind of the eschatological end. So in Daniel's visionary experience, kairos is clearly apocalyptic, as apocalyptic components. Quote, "As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time." And that's also in Daniel 7:12. And so that is kairos, or time, perhaps to note kind of the punctiliar kind of focal point of when God acts or will act, i.e. the coming glory. And Philo of Alexandria makes this point rather strongly. Sorry, I just realized. Give me 1 second. There we go. Quote, for virtue is and will be and has been in everything, which virtue perhaps is at times obscured among men or people by the want of opportunity, but which opportunity the minister of God brings again brings to light. And so I realize now that I'm looking at this, the question of kind of the nature of time in that apocalyptic lexeme. So I'll come back to the Philo quote in a second, and I'll reread it. The language that Paul uses of to be disclosed to us, there's it's apocalypto, if I recall correctly. And one of the issues there is it refers to uncovering or unveiling something, kind of disclosing something. And here, as it relates to time, you have the coming glory, but also the sufferings of the present critical time, and this response of disclosure. These things will be disclosed or made known to us. And there's kind of a mystery element there. But for apocalyptic, or that apocalypto, that verb, as it relates to time, so bringing those two together, I'll read Philo again. Quote, for virtue is and will be and has been in everything, which virtue perhaps is at times obscured among people by the want of opportunity, but which opportunity the minister of God again brings to light. Since Sarah, that is to say Prudence, brings forth a male child, flourishing, not according to the periodical seasons of the year, but according to those seasons and felicitous occasions which have no connection with time, for it is said, quote, I will surely return and visit thee according to the time of life, and Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And he's quoting from Genesis. And so notice kind of the constellation of terms or words. Time, God brings to light or unveils or discloses. Philo's use of time language here kind of corresponds to God's divine activity, which is explained in explicitly apocalyptic terms, apocalyptai, the unveiling or the showing of something, the disclosure of something specific. And so such activity is predicated upon divine revelation, upon kind of a punctiliar understanding of time, but you also have the idea of it being time also including a definitive act where God's activity is demarcated explicitly, where God acts in a decisive, specific, and focused way. And I think we often miss the idea of what God is kind of getting at. And so all that is going on suffering at the present critical time is then placed in direct contradiction to what will happen. So you might say the perceived immovable rock of death, or at least in our perspective, that cannot be shaken, must now contend with the encroaching divine invasion, i.e. the coming glory. And so as such, suffering at this present critical time intensifies the feeling of oppression and degradation, but casts a wider vision beyond the pain. So rather, it doesn't nullify it. Paul's intent isn't to kind of pat you on the head and be like, there, it'll all be okay. It's as if you stubbed your toe and that's all good. Rather, the issue is let's contextualize this pain. Let's not whitewash it. Let's not throw it away. Let's actually understand it in the way that God seems to be acting and working. And so, the use of worthy language, not worth comparing. The plural use of axia. Suggests that there's no comparison to be made across any spectrum of assertion or possibility or perspective or plausibility. The suffering is not an illusion or illusion. My illusions, if you get the reference, sorry. Nor are any possible solutions outside of what Christ and the Spirit, nor are there any possible solutions outside of what Christ and the Spirit offer. The whole idea of the fact that Paul uses a plural, worthy, means, I'm interpreting it this way, there's no possible comparison in any sort of given situation. The coming glory, the things that God is doing in the Spirit and by the Son, cannot compare or cannot be compared with the suffering. The suffering just doesn't compare to it. There's no it's too disjunctive and disruptive to be seen as truly comparing. And this is because, I think, and this is going a bit back further in Romans, God has already acted in Christ decisively, presenting him as the mercy seat in Romans 3:24 through 25. Now, some people debate it. Maybe one day I'll do a whole series on Romans 3, a very interesting portion of Scripture. But hilasterion there I take to be the mercy seat, because I think specifically, and Philo and others seem to take that or use that phrase that way specifically, which means that rather than the sacrifices, Jesus is now the temple. Jesus now replaces kind of the temple imagery, the cultic realm, the place where you had to perform all these rituals. Christ, in his presence, in his death, by his blood, is now transforming that idea and personifying it, perfecting it in his own flesh. And so, and this all in Romans 3 is based entirely on the patience of God. Again, the character of God, who demonstrated all of this, quote, at the present critical time. And God passed over the sins of old, Romans 3:25 and 26, in order to demonstrate that he is good and holy and righteous above all. The fact that God's patience and forbearance or offering clemency is offered instead of punishment tells us about who God is. This is the character of God revealed in Jesus Christ. And so, this coming glory, right in the verse, this realm of God's kind of radiant goodness and power is not yet present because it is coming towards us. It's not here in the station, if we're using a train metaphor. And so kind of this present-orientated aspect is confirmed by, of course, the tense of the verb. Porter calls this verb a verb of intention, where the focus and future now encroachment of God is certain. So it is a certain verb. It will happen, but it is not yet fully present or perfected. And so I think this perspective is fully explained in the next verses. But the verb apodekamai, eagerly wait, confirms the point that there is still something to be done. And I just realized Philo, what I read from Philo, that's Young's translation. You can tell because it's a little archaic. I love translating Philo, but some days you just go, okay, I'm just going to go with Young, because translating Philo is a pain in a good way. You learn a lot, but you'd almost rather translate Hebrews. And so, anyway, there's still something to be done. And so God, what we're getting at is, has acted, and we're in the midst of the unveiling or the full disclosure of this activity, which is seen again through a glass dimly. There's clarity that Paul finds, but the clarity reveals that there is something still to happen, something still to come, something that God is still doing. And so, one idea is that the closest referent, however, compared to the glory, is the co-glorification of Christ. So the question is, what is the coming glory? Well, traditionally you could say it's the eschaton, and I think that's probably right. But I think it also could be seen in the sense of co-glorification with Christ in the previous verses. And so you might say that it's both the parousia, but also the present co-glorification. These the two things are maybe, they're not united like so, but there's overlap there, which is theologically very interesting. And we see in the First Testament and in Jewish literature that glory and divinity, the use of doxa, the glory lexeme, are often woven together in Jewish literature. So you see Exodus 24:16, Psalm 18:2, Tobit 3:16, Psalms of Solomon 11:6. Yeah, I was thinking 11:5, but it's 11:6. And this idea is kind of suggestive of, say, divine power and awe and kind of genuine goodness and strength, kind of all these things that make up who God is and how God acts. And so suffering, at the end of the day, what Paul is getting at is suffering is part of the suffering is part of our own glory. That is our testament to God's radiance and goodness. And as such, glory is present in some sense because we are suffering. Glory and suffering together kind of harmonize. They're not seen as oil and water or things that kind of don't mix. Rather, they intensify one another. And It is hidden from us still, in some sense, as a future reality. But through our participation and co-suffering with Christ, we taste the first fruits of that glory. We taste the first fruits of what Christ has done for us. And that is why time in Pauline theology is so important. That's why these sufferings are so important. That's why at this present critical time is so important. That's why him saying, I think, or I consider, or I calculate, is so important. And that's why all this kind of comes together. And you can see why this took so long to write, to prepare and script and all that sort of stuff. There's so much here to think about. And if you punt everything kind of to the past, you miss out on what God will do. And if you punt everything to the future, you eschatologicalize everything, you miss out on everything that God has done. And so you need to have a balanced view of time. I'm not talking about A or B theory. I'm talking about a conception of time, a conception of divine activity, human agency, and history. And that's why this is all so important. And you can see why, for some folks, this looks like world-ending stuff. The famous rapture or the Left Behind stuff. I mean, I know the Left Behind stuff, my parents couldn't stand that stuff, but it was in kind of the church culture we were all a part of. And if all of you know, not the Nick Cage Left Behind, the one that I'm sure is actually quite wonderful to watch if you're in the right state of mind, but I watched the Kirk Cameron one. Shows how old I am and how old school I go. So, but for Paul, it's not that the world is going to change, it's that the world's already changed. His world is already ended. He now has the eyes of Christ, the mind of Christ, and the mind of the Spirit. The old world of, say, sin and death and Adam has fallen into utter and complete disarray, and the only hope is the coming glory that we feel now in our own bodies as we suffer for the sake of the one who suffered for us, for our glory. And I think Ben Witherington had a really interesting point here. He says that, quote, what is being discussed here is not present sanctification, although I would dispute that, but I get what he's getting at, but the internal and also external and eternal renovation that resurrection entails. See, for me, and Witherington's a Wesleyan, or I should say a Methodist. I don't know if he should actually be saying it's not present sanctification or anything like that. In fact, I think those two things harmonize quite nicely. I may know of a book that talks about perfection and sanctification and resurrection and Pauline theology. What book was that? I don't know. But in any sense, glory, in other words, can refer to God's kind of own presence in a given state or space or place. And Ezekiel 9:3 in the Septuagint says this perfectly. Quote, now the glory of the God of Israel, doxa theou to Israel, has gone up from the cherubims on which it rested to the edge of the home, or the house. And that's my translation. God's own presence is manifested in some way in a space of holiness. And so glory has a connotation of reverence, of sanctification, of God's own goodness and character being kind of at the forefront of this. And that's why this is also important. And the final phrase, let's see if I can say this. I always goof with Greek. Apocalypthanai, hemos, to be disclosed or unveiled to us or for us, confirms spirited believers, we might say spirited believers, as the recipients of this apocalyptic self-disclosure. That is, it is for us or to us, or you might say in us, depending on how you translate eis. That preposition's a little squiggly. It's a little weird. Well, not weird. That's not the right word. It's hard to interpret or translate because there's so many options often with it. I mean, it's not like en. Most times en means in, on, or among, or in or among. It's not that hard. But for some reason, eis, you just kind of, this could mean a few different things. So translate Greek at your own peril, friends. And so that infinitive, the to be disclosed, the apocalypthani, try saying that 10 times fast, clarifies and I think grounds the coming glory. It is something, and it also provides an object to or for us. So this glory is to be disclosed at a specific point for someone. So we are the objects of this disclosure. And this glory is also reflected of Isaiah 24:23, where God demonstrates his glory and power before humanity, and it's echoed here. You also have that in Leviticus 10:3, where it speaks of God revealing himself as holy to the people, and this is to his glory. Paul binds, I think, the entire discourse really around both his understanding of God's work and his conception of the present future glory of Christ and the Spirit, with humanity being the vital recipients of God's gracious apocalyptic revelation. This is what Paul thinks at the present critical time. And God has left us with a witness to the work of his Son, the Holy Spirit. And that's why the Spirit factors so prominently in Romans 8. And so to recap this one verse that we've spent a few minutes on, it's one of those things people it's like, well, I'd rather, instead of doing the TikTok 30-second videos or the 1-minute videos, I tried Vine for a while, actually, way back in the day. I don't think you can find any of that. But yeah, I did Vine while I was at Fuller, just goofing around. Well, suffice to say, I'd rather do the long-form content. I think it's a lot more interesting and a lot more substantive. But I'm also a nerd, and nerds like to talk about stuff they love. So I've drinking a lot of water, and I'm only 40 minutes into this. All right, so to recap this one verse, Paul's vision of God's work in the Spirit for humanity is predicated upon God's present, future, salvific activity. Paul's apocalyptic worldview is fixed upon divine agency and human participation as we cooperate and participate now and wait for the future consummation of all things. This dovetails, I think, very nicely into the next verse, where creation itself, a debated concept, has already been subjected for a purpose. And so you have some really interesting stuff already. So, Romans 8:19. Should I pause the video and take a break? Oh my gosh. No, we persist. All right. Quote, "For the created realm waits with anticipation for the revelation of the sons of God." So, if you want to know what I think sons of God means, look at the previous video where I talk about suffering and sonship. I'm not going to get into that now because that'll take too long. That felt really good. So we have an interesting issue here. What does exegesis or ktiseos. There we go. It's one of those where I'm looking, I'm like, I had a very specific way of thinking how to pronounce that. What does that refer to? Ktisis, creation. What does that refer to? So often you'll see a syntactical pairing, which is akin to, so you have apa, the Greek preposition apa, arches, ktiseos, so that phrase, from the beginning of creation, or from the beginning of creation, and that's in Mark 10:6 and 13:19, which the use of that creation lexeme, at least in Mark, suggests a time when you might say a punctiliar act or event in the act of God creating and fashioning the world. And so from the beginning, meaning from a specific point in time, X has happened. And so Mark's use of ktisis, or creation, suggests that the totality of the material world is in view. And one of the issues is a matter of emphasis. And some people say it's an either or kind of thing, or it's only this thing. Very often in the New Testament, it's usually a both and, but to varying degrees. I think that's a helpful actual way of thinking about it it keeps you from falling into kind of the bifurcated thinking that some of New Testament scholarship kind of gets into. I think it's kind of intriguing that Matthew, Luke, and John do not use the noun, and we're talking about the noun. We're not talking about the verb to create. Paul uses the noun in Romans 1:20 in a way that corresponds, I think, to Mark via the similar prepositional construction. So apa, kteseos, cosmo. So from the creation of the cosmos or creation of the world, depending on how you render it. But you notice that preposition is similar, or actually, no, it's not similar. It's the same preposition, which suggests, I think, two possibilities, or at least I can think of, I'm sure there's more, that katesis, or creation, functions as a verbal noun, indicating both the act of creation and the reality of creation. This is coordinate with the preposition apa in both instances, and Mark in Romans. From, apa meaning from. And two, that katesis describes the specific object of God's creation, cosmo. So the creation of the cosmos, or the creation of the world. And so cosmo refers to the entire cosmic order via God's creative power, creation, God's act and power to create. Paul's additional use in Romans 1:25 defines the human person represented via sexual immorality and the curse and the downfall and all that sort of stuff, as an ill-defined and sinful object of worship, katise, so similar word, or same lexeme. But this object is worshipped by other creatures, which of course the whole issue is, you get your worship wrong, you're going to have a really bad understanding of who God is. And so it is highly debatable about what Paul means by creation in Romans 8, but it's not debatable, at least in my mind, of how he's used creation language in the beginning of Romans already. And he uses it, I think, to define all of created reality. You might, and referring to it as animate or inanimate, or animal or human, I think is kind of irrelevant at that point. It's grasping at specific straws when it's just unnecessary to do so. That said, and I think I mentioned this to Ezekiel and Mr. Green in my Loose Leaf Homilies live stream on Sunday. The video actually talks, I think it actually has the phrase textual variant in Romans or something like that. We talk about that. But here, Richard Longnecker, bless his heart, and I mean that, bless his heart, surveys the 8 basic interpretive options that previous commentators have argued for understanding that creation lexeme, katesis in Romans 8:19. They are as follows, and I'm going to read them all because that we do. 1. That katesis refers to an all-encompassing fashion. That katesis refers in an all-encompassing fashion to all of God's creation. That is, not only to the subhuman creation, both animate and inanimate, but also to all humans, both believing and unbelieving, and to the heavenly angels, though not the fallen angels. He cites C.K. Barrett, a famous New Testament scholar, is affirming that. 1 second, let me jot something down. I'm the kind of person, as I demonstrated very ably on the live stream for Loose Leaf Homilies, that I need to write stuff down or else I forget it. So I just had to write something down very specifically. So, all right, going back to the 8. So that was number 1. Number 2, that katesis refers to created subhuman earthly life, both animate and inanimate, that is to, quote, the non-rational creation, end quote, or to what people call, quote, nature, end quote, as differentiated from people, whether believing or unbelieving, and angels, whether heavenly or fallen. And that is the view of Charles Cranfield, C.E.B. Cranfield. And Cranfield, at least at the time of this, according to Longnecker, is kind of the pioneer of this view specifically. It seems actually this is probably the majority report, at least in commentators, at least the commentaries I've read. You have Joseph Fitzmyer, Leon Morris, Jimmy Dunn, Kazemon, Bart, perhaps. So certainly there's substantial commentaries there, or commentators that affirm it. Number 3, that katesis signifies all of humanity or the entire human race in line with Augustine's understanding. but not the subhuman creation, animate or inanimate, and not angels, heavenly or fallen, with the term being used in this passage, as Adolf Schlatter once spoke of it, as, quote, humanity's honorific name, end quote, which signifies, quote, a homogeneous or uniform closed circle of created people. And, of course, that's Schlatter, a famous German scholar. That's number 3. Number 4, that catesis here should be understood to refer to believers in Jesus. Simple. Number 5, that catesis here refers to the created body of a believer in Jesus, and so should be translated creature and not creation. That is the view of Michaels and perhaps Irenaeus. Number 6, the term here has in view unbelievers. Number 7, that the term here refers to both the subhuman creation and unbelieving humanity, though not angels, demons, or unbelievers. And number 8, that the term here refers to angels. So, that felt good. All right, so Longnecker, following Cranfield and probably most others, argue specifically for option 2, subhuman earthly life, both animate and inanimate, or non-animate. The reasoning they offer is as follows, and I'll let you know what I think after I list them. Point 1. Believers must almost certainly be excluded since verse 23 they are contrasted with creation. That's the first point they make in support of the majority opinion. I almost said opinion and view, so it became pew. Pew. All right. So that's point 1. Point 2. The expression uk akusa, not willingly or not by its own choice, so it's a free will lexeme, seems to rule out mankind generally, for if Paul meant to include mankind when he used catesis here, he can hardly have intended to exclude Adam, the created man par excellence. Had he intended to make so strange an exception, he must surely have indicated it. And Adam, at any rate, cannot be said to have been subjected freely, and he cites Greek here. Hukusa, it's hekusa to matoietes. There we go. I'll never make fun of someone for mispronouncing Bart as Barth, just simply because if they say Barth, that means they read Bart and probably read a lot more Bart and didn't have someone nerdy to correct them, even though they're probably not wrong at this point. I just might as well call them Barth. Same thing with Greek. You know, I used to get kind of snippy about it with people. I'm like, actually, it says it's like, just, you know, you can hop up on your high horse as much as you want, until you realize the high horse just kicked you off and you're kind of stuck with it. So better just to avoid it. Number 3, against the suggestion that only unbelieving mankind is referred to, it may be urged that this would involve an extremely unnatural distinction. For while it is understandable that cosmos should sometimes be used to denote unbelievers in contrast with believers, it is very hard to imagine a New Testament writer using catesis in this way, a term specifically indicating a relationship to God, or relation to God, which is not only one in which Christians stand no whit less than non-Christians, but also one which they above all men must acknowledge and delight in. That's number 3. Number 4, a reference to angels seems not very likely. Likewise, the use of catesis to denote the angels alone, and the use of it to denote the angels in addition to subhuman nature with mankind excluded, would seem about equally unlikely. Further, it is hardly possible to give any really convincing interpretation of the subjection language and all that sort of stuff in respect to the angels. So those 4 points in support of point number 2. So you can see there's a lot to unpack there, but they take the second option out of the 8 above that I listed. I think the 8 options are kind of interesting, as far as they go at least. But I think at the end of the day, one, this is just so common in New Testament scholarship. There is just an absolute preference for the minutia, to the point where you almost just kind of think people are just trying to. Anyway, I'm going to be nice. I think the 4 points offered by Cranfield and Longnecker are, I think, kind of misguided for numerous reasons. So first, aspectively, the entire cosmic order is not seen in disparate pieces. A little, subhuman strata over there, a little heavenly activity over here, kind of etc. And so such a point, I think, already kind of suffers from an either or overcommitment. So you really run the risk in a lot of these sorts of comments and arguments of preferring an either or fallacy when it is probably more likely and stable to argue that both and, but in matters of emphasis or matters of degree of importance. And so I think Longnecker and Cranfield do a little bit of that. And so point number 1, this is Cranfield. Believers must almost certainly be excluded, since in verse 23 they are contrasted with creation. Now, we will talk more about verse 23 in an hour. But I think this is a flawed argument. Believers aren't contrasted with creation, nor are we somehow raptured out of this conversation as if we're irrelevant to this point. Notice the parallelism. Both creation and the ones who have the first fruits of the spirited ones, also lament amongst ourselves, and hiatois stenatsamon. We also lament amongst ourselves. We are not contrasted with creation. We are co-participants in the same groaning and lament because we haven't been raptured from creation and pulled out of it. We are still in the created realm. We are still within the Adamic fold, albeit as adopted sons and daughters under the Spirit, living in a new creation or living with a new creation mindset. But if we kind of go this route that they are suggesting, you run the risk of this sort of separation that is just not warranted contextually. I think this also misconstrues the idea of suffering as the ones with the Spirit suffer as well. So you have co-suffering, you have co-glorification, you have present suffering. You have Paul even considering how suffering works at the present critical time. So time itself is important to understanding this as well. You have the issue of suffering as a reality for these people. And to kind of section that off here, I think, is just contextually unwarranted. There's no reason for that to actually happen. So I don't think Cranfield's point is actually substantiated. Recall also that we are co-heirs with Christ if indeed we suffer with him. And that's Romans 8:17, literally the 2 verses back. Sum pasco, right? The co-suffer, to suffer with. And so I think the point is just insufficient and probably incorrect. Probably. Point number 2, and I think I get the gist of what he's saying, but it is, it feels a little convoluted, but I'll read it again. The expression, not willingly or by its own free choice, seems to rule out mankind generally. For if Paul meant to include mankind when he used catesis here, he can hardly have intended to exclude Adam, the created man par excellence. Had he intended to make so strange an exception, he must surely have indicated it, and Adam at any rate clearly cannot be said to have been subjected. And so, that is, Adam was not subjected. Now, I think this point has a little bit of weight. I think it's still not that weighty, but it has more weight than the first point. I think it's overconfident. So you have Adam and Eve given the Genesis 1 and 2 accounts. We're not subjected in the same sense as Romans 8 as a whole. Sure. But again, the issue of time, the issue of events is important. When would they have been subjected? And the answer is in the curse, when the curse came. You have the cursing and going back to the dirt, and you have all these sorts of ideas. You have the unraveling of civilization and all this sort of stuff where humanity and creation just kind of begin to go off the rails, and God has to kind of steer us back. And so, again, especially if we take the Adamic reading of Romans 7, I think it dovetails very nicely, and it has a really nice coherence there. Brendan Byrne sees Paul's use of catesis here as referring to, quote, the entire non-human world which the biblical creation stories present as the essential context for human life, end quote. I think that's helpful because at least he's bringing creation into this, but I don't think it goes far enough. Humanity post-curse would surely be in a state of subjection, and if you just have Adam as kind of part of it, it just depends on when Adam would be subjected. If Adam is subjected post-curse, then that makes sense. Subjected via a sort of removal from the garden, the removal of immortality, the removal of all this, but also the hope that immortality would come back into creation through the Son and the Spirit. And so I think Cranfield's third point is a bit of a non sequitur. I don't think it follows. So he says, I have to read this again. All right. Against the suggestion that only unbelieving mankind is referred to, it may be urged that this would involve an extremely unnatural distinction. For while it is understandable that cosmos should sometimes be used to denote unbelievers in contrast with believers, it is very hard to imagine a New Testament writer using catesis in this way, a term specifically indicating a relation to God which is not only one in which Christians stand no whit less than non-Christians, but is also one which they above all men must acknowledge and delight in. So, simply put, I think it is not hard to imagine Paul or any New Testament author being creative with words. Further, taking catesis, quote, as a term specifically indicating a relation to God is not at all contradictory to taking cosmos in the same way. In fact, Romans 1:20 seems to kind of push against Cranfield's kind of argument here. Quote, for since the creation of the world, kateseos cosmou, nailed that, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. That's from the NIV. I just went with the NIV. The combination of lexemes here strongly suggests that catesis and cosmos can certainly be coordinate in meaning. Namely, they can speak specifically to a relationship to God, to tweak Cranfield's phraseology. And the entire point is that God's divine apocalyptic power is already demonstrated in the very act of creation, right? In the very act of creation, you see God's demonstration of power and creativity and goodness. And the resultant reality that is creation. So God's activity is already manifested in this created order, in this created realm. And so I think Cranfield's point is simply misguided. It's unnecessary. It doesn't follow. It's semantically unnecessary. And his fourth point, I think, is curious. Quote, a reference to angels seems not very likely. Likewise, the use of catesis to denote the angels alone and the use of it to denote the angels in addition to subhuman nature with mankind excluded would seem to be about equally unlikely. Further, it is hardly possible to give any really convincing interpretation of te metoiteta, or, oh my gosh. It makes sense up here seeing it, just saying it, I'm like, oh my gosh. Mataoiteti, hupatage, uk hakusa, there we go. In respect to the angels. So there we go. I get to go back to the language I'm mildly okay at by butchering the Greek language I claim to love. But you have to have a sense of humor with Greek, I think. So, simply put, I would agree that the angels, whether fallen or righteous or whoever, are not primarily in view. But given Paul's apocalyptic epistemology and his understanding of cosmology, it isn't difficult to believe that angelic figures are in the background as they are part of the created order. In fact, they are mentioned in in several videos from now, but in Romans 8. Angels, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Angels, rulers, principalities, life, death, heights, depths. Are angels to be so far removed from this question? I don't think so. That doesn't mean they are primarily in view, which I think is right. They are not primarily in view, but that does not mean they are excluded entirely from view, especially given the apocalyptic worldview that Paul affirms. Paul believes these things. And so I don't think Longnecker or Cranfield's points, sorry, I'm moving the mic a little bit because my back is starting to hurt and I need to lean a little and crack. So apologies for the cracking. If that grosses you out, sorry. Grosses me out sometimes. Story note, just for a sec, take a break and think about something else. One of the issues I had as a teen was just a really bad back. Had a really bad slump and slouched a lot. Started working out, got better, then couldn't work out, then hurt myself, not too badly, but in the move, which, lifting tons of heavy things very quickly over an extended period of time. Basically moved, 2 massive truck worths, one with help, another with no help. That was all me. That was very fun. You can go back and watch some videos from about a month ago. You can see me. I look like I'm about to die. But yeah, it's a very interesting experience. So yeah, if you're able to take care of your back when you're younger, do so. But the Lord is good all the time. All right, back to this. So my thought is I affirm point number 1, albeit slightly modified. Exegesis refers to the totality of all animate and inanimate life, whether persons, angels, demonic figures, and personified elements and entities, like political figureheads or even the personification of creation itself. I think the created realm includes everything of creation, with varying degrees of emphasis. So angels probably aren't emphasized as much. The created order, like nature itself, probably at the forefront of it, but not to the extent of shoving everything else off the bookshelf. It's just a book that's most prominent on the shelf. And human beings, I think, are part of this as well. And so there is simply, in my opinion, there is no good reason to be so restrictive with creation here. Given Paul's own, I would argue, very expansive worldview, I think I've demonstrated that very strongly. Such a view includes humanity as a whole, with Christians being a representative group within this created order. To bifurcate or divide between animate and inanimate is feels a little modernistic, like a more modern way of understanding the ancient world, or our world, which would kind of project back onto the ancient world. And I think the ancient world had a much more interrelated understanding of how things worked or didn't work, things in conflict, entities and gods and powers and stuff. So yeah, all this to say, I think it is best to take creation here as referring to all of created reality with various emphases. So let me know what you think of that in the comments. If you haven't commented and you skipped the first part of the video, comment and let me know what you think. I'm sure plenty of you, I'm continually blown away by how wise and smart and funny my both my patrons and my viewers are, because there is this, y'all are, there may come a day where this channel makes enough money to where I can fly out to have like a little theology nerd conference hangout thingy with all of y'all, or maybe a few of them. I don't know. I think that'd be a blast. So one of those things. Call it a lofty vision for this guy right here. So a final point, just to wrap up this verse, and would you believe it? We're actually about halfway through. So let's see if we can keep going. The infinitival phrase apocalypthanai eis hemos, and that's Romans 8:18. So going back a few clauses, is suggestive of the human place within Exegesis, within creation. That is, the revelatory aspect of God's coming glory in Christ is granted or disclosed to humanity within the cosmic order. That is, this is an event that is visible, invasive, and forceful, and we, along with all of creation, in our futility, we are still stuck in all of this, await this apocalyptic act of God. And creation is the totality of what God has made, and that has fallen under the curse. However, this subjection, as we'll see, is not a mere act of whimsy or a defiant tyrannical act of brutality or of brute masculinity or what have you, as we'll see. In fact, I think this language here is not isolated in Romans 9 through 11. I think it actually keeps going into Romans 11, which has some really interesting implications for how we think theologically about Romans 11. But we'll get there in probably a few months. So, having been personified and given a voice, and Robert Jewett makes a lot of this, and I think he's right to do so, the created realm, quote, waits with anticipation for the revelation of the sons of God. Such a unique and curious phrase, invite some sort of explanation, as we are kind of left on our own with not a lot to go on as to what the phrase actually means. We know what sons of God means. It probably refers to familial relationships. Probably doesn't have a massive eschatological component, at least on its own, but the inclusion of the apocalyptic lexeme, or the word group, is interesting. So it's actually possible that, according to Robert Jewett, and he's following Hai-Kyung Chang, his article in Zeitschrift für die New Testamentliche Wissenschaft, it's a German journal, they both argue very strongly that this word, anticipate, apokaradoxia. It suggests a sort of expectation, but Paul is probably the first person to coin this term, or at least in terms of the literature we see, and that's according to Robert Jewett and Chang. So what this tells us, this use of this verb, the created realm being personified, at least in some sense, is what we might call an ideation metaphor, as Porter calls it, is living in a state of flux, a state of expectancy for a specific event or a group or something. It's anticipating something. And this corrosive kind of ecosystem, nature being bound up in sin and death and all sorts of things, is kind of a cauldron of chaos waiting to overflow. And that's why you can explain certain natural or so-called natural phenomena. You see all these sorts of things going on in the world that don't make a lot of sense, but not just weird things. And it's kind of the tipping point of the Adamic realm, and kind of being bound up in the decline of civilization, the decline of creation itself, and has kind of asserted itself to the nth degree. The creation is kind of reasserting and pushing back and fighting and kind of interacting with humankind, and is shown to be wanting. It's shown to be in need. It's shown to be in a state that is unhealthy and unwise and corrosive and corrupting. And creation is not a static force or a passive thing, which it tells us a bit about eco-theology as well, if you think about it. I mean, even according to Genesis, Adam and Eve had dominion over creation, which tells us that creation needed to be tamed. Creation was wild. And creation was not some sort of settled thing, so to speak. And that's in Genesis 1:26 and following. And so we cannot forget that the apostolic call, Paul's apostolic call, is to go even to those who have oppressed the world through violence, greed, and exploitation and avarice. The fact that Paul is bringing this message to Rome to go forth into Spain, he's the apostle to the Gentiles, means he even though they've oppressed and committed horrific acts and violence and stuff, he's still going to them with the gospel. He still sees them as God saw him, as worthy of salvation, worthy of deliverance, worthy of new life, worthy of the Spirit. And that's where allegiance is so important. That's why we say that the character of God is what matters. And so God, even then, is willing to come to them in the hands of Paul, of Junia, of Phoebe, of Mary and Aquila and Prisca, and all these sorts of people. God is willing to come to the Gentile world, come to the Jewish world, come to the world as a whole that is in subjection and pain, and offer deliverance out of that. And this entire realm is waiting for the revelation of the sons of God, which again is not defined. And so Robert Jewett quotes Joseph Fitzmyer, who argues that the phrase refers to glorified Christians. Origen of Alexandria has a bit of a different take on this. He writes, quote, "The rational creation has a certain expectation and sets hope for that time when the glory of the sons of God is going to be revealed. That is, when the things that have been prepared for those who will be deemed worthy to be sons of God will be revealed. Or at least when, because the veil with which they are covered has been taken away from them, they themselves will be manifested to be sons of God." And so Fitzmyer and Origen are, I think, at the end of the day, largely in agreement that sons of God are referring to Christians or those who are deemed worthy. Michael Bird refers to this time in terms of contested identity being truly known as well. And so support for this view, I think, comes in Romans 8:14, and I take this view. I think it's probably true. It's still a little ambiguous in my mind, but I think it's probably true. Romans 8:14, where all who are led by God's Spirit are, quote, sons of God. And so I think this is a reasonable view of who exactly comprises the identity of the idiom. Paul is referring to a time when God finally acts with full decisive power to make known all the things that lay hidden. And that is part and parcel of the apocalyptic worldview, making the hidden things known. Sirach 42:19 puts it this way, quote, the Lord proclaims what has been and what will be, and he unveils, apocalypto, the footprints of secret things, end quote. And that's my translation. Quote, revelation of the sons of God includes those who were faithful to Jesus, who put to death the exploits of the body, and lived and live in participatory harmony with the Spirit. All of them opposed to the regime of Satan, Caesar, sin, and death. And so that's who I think the sons of God are. And that is something that is revealed or made known to the world. Think of it in terms of vindication. Romans 8:20 and 21. For creation was subjected unto futility, not by its free will, but through the one who subjected it, in hope, because even creation itself will be emancipated from the enslavement of corruption for the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So I think we spent long enough on creation. It feels like I've been here forever, but I don't think I have. It just feels like it. And I think this is the same creation as we saw in the previous verse. However, the creation itself, groaning in oppression and agony, is not in the place it ought to be. And I think that's pretty obvious. Creation has gone awry, and we see this in kind of the unordered state of our bodies, of our politics, of our relationships. And you might even say of all the global events we see on the nightly news, right? We see decay, we see immorality, and we see death. And this futility here is fixed very strongly on the idea of not of feebleness. That's probably not quite the right word, but of a sense of emptiness, a sense of frustration, of these sorts of restricted, of emptiness, which fits nicely with anticipation or expectation or longing. It's subjected because it cannot function in the way it needs to function. It cannot do the things that it needs to do. It cannot be what it needs to be. And there's an unorderedness to this that creation itself has spun off of its axis and now is just going haywire. And we see how this creation acts contra an opposing power, how this creation acts in response to other powers. Like the mind hostile to God, and earlier in Romans 8, it does not willingly submit, or it doesn't have the power or to do it. Although I don't know how far you can press that, because how God acts with creation as a whole versus how God interacts with a person may be a little different. Because you see in the Old Testament all over the place how God interacts with a city versus how God interacts with a person. Often there's a bit of a disjunction there. But that said, creation resides in a state of pained stasis. And the $10 million question, I think, is, who subjected it? Who subjected it? Paul uses what's called a substantival participle, meaning an articular participle, which functions essentially as a noun. the person doing something. He's describing a specific agent or person. I hope y'all are commenting right now. Oh. So, Stan Porter posits that, quote, most commentators understand it, that is the word referring to God. They see it as referring to God, even to the point of calling it a divine passive, which makes me chuckle because the substantival participle is in the active tense form. It's an active verb. So calling it a divine passive is a little... Robert Jewett sees this idiom, or I should say this lexium, as referring to God's curse against the, quote, God's curse against the land in response to human sin. I think that's true. I also don't think that answers the question. We're still a little nebulous on what the actual question I've asked is. One of the closest parallels, I think, in this one is, I don't think debatable. It could be I'm wrong, but I don't think it's debatable. Okay, not debatable in the sense of reasonable people, can't think differently. I'm not saying that at all. I think it's clear. This is maybe what I should communicate. Philippians 3:21 reads as follows, quote, Christ will transform our debased body to be like the body of his glory, by the power that enables him even to subject, hupotasso, all things to himself. So notice similar words: body, transformation, glory, submit or subject, or to subject. Here, at least, these words show that Paul has Christ being the operative agent who subordinates all hostile powers and places them under his feet. And that, of course, happens in 1 Corinthians 15:25 and following. And elsewhere, God puts all things under Christ's feet. So I think it is entirely possible, not certain, but possible, that Christ is the one who has subjected, or is in the process of subjecting, given that the verb is active. And Hebrews 2:5-9 actually suggests that not all things have been subjected yet by the Son. Not all things are. He's not fully subjected all things to himself. Christ is the one who has subjected the created realm, but it's done in hope. It's not done out of capriciousness. It's not done out of all these things. What seems to be the case, and this is again tentative, is that Christ as creator, who knows creation, has subjected creation to a specific state after allowing creation to be what it wanted to be. It went off its moors, Christ subjected it, but did so not because of punishment, because of hope. Subjected it in hope. And there's some textual variants there, but I don't think they're as interesting. There's one later on I think is more interesting. But I think this gives a lot of fruit for kind of developing kind of a Trinitarian doctrine of this, for Trinitarian reading of Paul. For Trinitarian reading of Paul, one of the best books is Wesley Hill's Paul and the Trinity. Amazing book. Based off, I think it's based off his doctoral thesis, Wesley Hill's, at Durham. But I don't know if he tackles Romans 8, but he tackles a lot of so-called subordinationist texts that I think in a very compelling and creative way. But all this to say, the subjection by negative power is not permitted as a plausible reading. So it's not as if Satan or sin or death are the ones who subjected it, at least initially. You have things going off the rails and then Christ kind of coming in and boom, taking care of it. But the prepositional in hope tells us the character of the one who subjected the created order. So even though creation resisted, it could not resist, or I should say stop, the incarnation of the Son. So even if one wants to posit that God is the one who does it, that still doesn't get to the heart of the question, because if we believe that God is triune, as we should, then you have to ask the question, which person of the Trinity primarily did it? And I think there's a good reason to think that it's Christ. So, I don't know. I don't know if y'all think that's interesting or not. I think it's very interesting. As we have other texts where Christ is explicitly called the Creator, so at least he was around before creation. I don't know. Maybe it's a little weird to y'all, but that's what I'm thinking. I'm gonna take this hat off because I'm gonna let the guy who needs a haircut completely go with. Whoo. Yeah, okay, I'll cover this up. Yeah, y'all, I'm not gonna subject y'all to that. Although maybe we'll go backwards. No, that looks worse. We'll just go with this. There we go. Even creation itself will be emancipated from the enslavement of corruption for the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So, the verb emancipated, eleuthereo, is used throughout Paul to denote freedom from kind of the domain and dominion and tyrannical kind of realm of sin. Think Romans 6, 18 through 22. You go there and read that. There's lots of freedom and slave language there. In the Old Testament, the verb is commonly used to speak of the freedom of slaves. So I think Exodus 21:2, Exodus 21:5, Exodus 21 verses 26 and 27, Deuteronomy 15:12 through 18, all in the Septuagint. And so this is a very real point, because often we like to spiritualize, spiritual freedom and all that sort of stuff. There's no evidence that this is a metaphor or some sort of spiritual nebulous reality. Rather, it seems like freedom is a real thing for Paul here. This is God's kind of ultimate apocalyptic act of liberation for the totality of creation. The creation who laments and those who lament alongside one another are offered genuine freedom in Christ. That is why the baptismal formulas in Paul are so important, specifically Galatians 3:28. There's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And I think this all results in what we call participatory deliverance or salvation. It's offered to all as humanity responds to God through the same will that resisted God. The will that resisted is now given a new paradigm. It is given an object of faith that it can understand and live into. That is Christ and the Spirit. And this God shares his glory with his children, the same children who are the ones who will inherit, who have a co-inheritance with Christ in Romans 8:13 through 17. If one is identified by God as a co-heir with Christ, then they are not seen as a slave within their former bondage. Freedom trumps their enslavement. And so I really bristle at the idea of kind of when pastors, and I'm sure I've said stuff like this before too, but pastors go, spiritual freedom, spiritual this, spiritual slavery. It's like, no, people are slaves, dude. Like, slavery is not just a far off thing. It's not some sort of sexy sex trafficking thing, and I don't mean sexy in a good way. I mean, people love to talk about sex trafficking as if that's the only form of trafficking. There's a lot more going on in the realm of trafficking. There's a lot more going on in sin and exploitation than all these sorts of things. But the gospel is a proclamation of freedom, a freedom to the oppressed and a warning to the oppressor, that even the oppressor will be judged, but even he or she can have freedom, can find redemption, can find liberation, can find reconciliation. But that requires a renunciation of the thing that they possess, namely their power to enslave and exploit. And so I really want us to take hold of the image of genuine freedom in Christ as an actual act of liberation. It is something that calls us out of the darkness. It is something that brings us into new life and new light. It is not just something, I now feel better. It's like, no, you're called a beloved son, a beloved daughter, a beloved child. You have an inheritance because God has been thinking about you for a long time. God desires you to come into God's family, and so on and so forth. And we get this, I think, very strongly in the next two verses. So Romans 8:22 and 23. There's always someone out there. I don't know what goes on with folks. There's always someone out there making lots of noise. Comment below. Do you have this in where you live? Or comment in the chat or wherever. But anyway. Always a loud car. Always this time of night. I swear if they wake up my baby boy. I swear if they wake up my baby boy. I got him to bed early too, so I could do this. Oh my goodness. Anyway. For we know that all of creation joins in lament together in the agony of childbirth together. I'm being intentionally repetitious because you have a soon prefix, the with, or, with all over the place there. Until now. Not only this, but even we, the first fruits of those who possess the Spirit, also lament among ourselves, anticipating the liberation of our bodies. So as I've argued and shown above, all of creation is lamenting and groaning together, albeit in different ways. The oppressors, the violent, the greedy, Caesar, Satan are probably excluded from this lament. I think they're the perpetrators of they're the sort or the reason why people are lamenting. It's probably a good way of saying it. So maybe a distinction is in order here. Creation or created realm refers to the totality of those who are oppressed by Caesar, Satan, death, and sin. So maybe there's a distinction worth making there. We'll see. In Josephus, the verb to lament or to groan is used to describe the wailing of a king. Jewish Wars 183. He writes, quote, however, and this is Whiston's commentary, translation. However, since some fate or others makes my house desolate and perpetually raises up those who are dearest to me against me, I will with tears lament my hard fortune and secretly groan under that verb, under my lonesome condition. Yet am I resolved that no one who thirsts after my blood shall escape punishment. Yet I am resolved that no one who thirsts after my blood shall escape punishment, although the evidence should extend itself to all of my sons. That's from the Jewish Wars 1, Book 1, Chapter 628. And you also have that in Philo as well. So you have what's called a soon prefix. I already mentioned it. So it's basically a preposition that, instead of functioning as a preposition, gets attached to the word and forms kind of a compound word. The soon prefix here, soon, I could pull it up and just look at it. Yes, sustanazzo. Yeah. It implies, or is explicit, I should say, about shared activity between agents or groups. But the verb itself, combined with the prefix, is suggestive of deep mourning and distress within a community or a group or a city or so on and so forth, as it relates often to a community or a city under siege or so on and so forth. And so this kind of begs a question. How can all of creation, subjected by the Son to a specific state, be ruled by the forces of evil? Part of the issue is having to answer a deeply philosophical question on the New Testament Theologist YouTube channel. So as someone who's not trained in philosophy but has the hat, I think I can attempt something provisional, just because this question arose just in my research. I'm just reading here. I'm like, I need to actually think about this question. You can think of it as this. The Son has a rightful claim to the throne, but this throne has been seized by competing evil forces and his lordship and character besmirched and usurped. I think given the apocalyptic landscape, this is entirely coordinate with Paul's understanding and language elsewhere, say in 1 Corinthians 15. Christ is actively working against such sovereignties and powers and lordships, and we do not see all things ordered as they ought to be yet. The oppressors, the violent, the cruel, they are still in power, at least for a time. We still travail in lament or anguish, undergoing what Paul calls sun odina, to suffer great anguish, or quote, to suffer great anguish or pain together with the implication of an important and creative event. That's Lunida 6250. And often this word, minus the soon prefix, denotes physical childbirth. 1 Samuel 4:19, Sirach 7:27. And so this kind of birthing language tied in with Christ's sovereignty is very fixed on instances, fixed on the idea of waiting for something to happen that is both painful and inevitable. And so I think what you have simply is Christ has subjected, Christ has acted, Christ is also subjecting and working to bring things under his sovereign control. The issue then becomes is how far do you extend that, but that I think takes us far beyond. And let me know in the comments. This raises issues on the problem of evil. Hopefully I know a few philosophy guys and systematic theology guys. I'm sure you got thoughts. I'd love to hear them. I'm learning too. In other instances, though, the birthing language, the pain, birth and pain language, is the entity is personified. It's given a voice, like creation was given a voice, undergoing suffering like a mother in childbirth. One of the most graphic depictions is in Isaiah 13:6-11, and I'll read this. This is from, and this is a really interesting combination of apocalyptic, judgment, eschatological, and that lexeme of childbirth. So, quote, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt, and they will be dismayed. Pangs, odines, and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish, like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. See, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the earth a desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant, and lay low the insolence of tyrants." And so such language is brutal and graphic, but it shows that in kind of the apocalyptic worldview, at least in first century Judaism, or at least Second Temple Judaism, there is a sense of anticipation, of waiting, of expecting a certain event, and also of God's eschatological deliverance where he destroys his enemies. There is a very strong sense of God responding to the evil done in creation and to creation, that allows humankind to basically pay back what they did. You are held to account for what you did, not only to one another, but to the very creation that you've been given and entrusted to. And that's kind of bringing Genesis 1 back into the fold. And so the coming of the great God, with glory, against all oppression and violence, results in utter extinction. There is nothing that can survive, and there's no competing sovereignties in God's creation. And so you have kind of an already not yet kind of aspect going on. The use of birth pangs denotes apocalyptic or eschatological activity and kind of rumblings. Events in creation and beyond that are fraught with peril and terror. Creation itself, how far you press the personification, is seen as an unwilling victim of bondage and exploitation. And so all of creation being redeemed carries a question. I'm sure a few people are asking it. Does this imply soteriological universalism? My PhD is on this subject. Very slowly working on it, obviously, given the times. I don't think so. One, because of the Jewish apocalyptic literature landscape, there's no such thing as soteriological universalism. The Jewish people are lucky. Many of them are lucky to get into heaven, whatever you want to call it. You do have certain texts in Paul that I think imply a sort of universal scope, but that also requires soteriological determinism, which I don't think Paul believed. And given Romans 8, everything that's said in Romans 8 about the Spirit and participation seems unlikely. What you see in Paul, I think, is universal soteriological contingency. That is, God is reconciled and is reconciling and will set free all of creation from bondage, but this requires union with the Spirit to be fully actualized. You can free someone from what has happened, what they've done, but it is on them to participate rightly in this new creation, in this new reality. And so, essentially what you get here, I don't see how you can get universalism from it. I see a cosmic and universal scope and intent, but not the result, which is what is a deterministic result, which is what is required for universalism to work. Oddly enough, it requires some form of Calvinism, which I'm sure some of my Calvinist brothers and sisters are pulling their hair out right now, but that's just true. Sorry. At least in Wesleyanism and Arminianism, there's no guarantee of universal salvation. Although I do think in Wesleyanism, or at least in my view, God's universalist, but he's not a determinist. So, but I'll leave that to be discussed later when I've actually published and written more on the subject. No, that's not right. No. There we go. So, creation, rumbling, birth pangs, anticipation. Paul then drops an abrupt until now, which implies regime change. We lamented together without hope until hope arrived in the flesh of the incarnated Son of God, who has conquered the power of death and continues to establish his reign over all things. And so the possession, our contest, the possession or taking or possessing of the Spirit is a I would argue a decisive factor of our new identity in Christ as sons of God, where our lives are bound up by the Spirit. Here, first fruits, I think, the first fruits of the Spirit, of the ones who possess the Spirit, is a living metaphor, or an organic metaphor, a horticultural metaphor, you might say, designed to spread to others. So first fruits implies the initial impact with a massive harvest in mind. We go with the Spirit, and we take the proclamation of freedom in Christ, and hopefully the first fruits have an impact in other people's lives, and they become participants. Let's call it evangelism. Our possession of the Spirit involves our cooperation and participation in the life of the Spirit. As we lamented together, so too we serve and submit together with the Spirit. All this, I think, is perfectly coordinate with Paul's notion of, say, adoption, but again, a problem arises, and this is something I talked about in the Loose Leaf Homily. Did Paul, a la Tertius, originally pen the word for adoption? You'll notice, if you heard me reading it, that Paul doesn't, that I left out awaiting adoption, the liberation of our bodies. I did not include adoption in my translation. So, huithesion, the word for adoption, is in the majority report in the manuscript tradition or the textual tradition. Most manuscripts contain the word, and this starts in the 4th century. So, 4th century have Sinaiticus and Vaticanus B, really important manuscripts and codices. 5th century have Alexandrinus, Ephraimi, really solid, helpful stuff. And then 9th century you have 33, 049, 1900, and past them including the Textus Receptus and the Nestle Aland 28th edition, Greek New Testament. However, the earliest manuscript that we have of Romans does not contain the word. P46 is a papyri that contains Romans, make sure I get this, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Hebrews, which is probably the only good argument for thinking Paul wrote Hebrews. It is called the Chester Beatty Papyri, and similarly, the Western text omits the word. So you have 3rd century, P46, actually it's circa 200 CE is kind of the general consensus, although people dispute things, of when that's written, of when P46 was written. The Western text, 6th century D06, and then 9th century F010 and G012. So the Western text, as a geographic literary unit, omits huithesion, and so does P46. Now, if P46 did not omit it, but included it, I wouldn't even be talking about this right now. But the clear majority report is the majority report for a good reason, because of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus B. But the omission of the word in P46 is a bit of a problem. So what is more likely to happen? This is the issue of internal criteria. A scribe adds a word or a scribe omits a word. More likely, generally speaking, this is all generalities, generally speaking, a scribe is more inclined to smooth out the text by inserting something for clarity. And so, for example, as such, the inclusion of huithesion makes sense as an attempt to clarify Paul's adoption language. I mean, Paul's already talked about adoption before. They are awaiting adoption, which is the liberation of our bodies. It helps make the sentence flow just fine. But the sentence also makes complete sense without huithesion, adoption. It makes complete sense without it. You don't need it. But it's inserted to help clarify what does this all look like. So More likely than not, it seems that it is more likely than not that they would have inserted it to help make sense of the passage more. Again, generally speaking. But interestingly, adoption in Romans 8:15 is spoken of as us already having obtained or accepted adoption. So it's something we already have. It's not something we're waiting for. So I think internally and contextually, adoption is something we already possess. We are already sons of God. At least in some sense. I'd say, yeah, we are already sons of God. So the question then becomes, is this something we're waiting for in verse 23 for it to happen? Or is verse 23 not even speaking to adoption? And so I think it is more likely than not, based on that point and based on P46, that huithesion, adoption, is not original to verse 23. I'm making this point based on the internal evidence and the contextual evidence and the manuscript evidence of P46. So if that's interesting to you, great. Comment, let me know. I'm really curious because I always find textual critical stuff very interesting. There was a part of me that wanted to do an entire video series just talking about textual criticism and just, hey, there's this really interesting one about women being silent in the churches. That one might be a textual, and what we call a gloss or an insertion or an interpolation. What about this one where a single word or a single letter within a word is a major textual variant, and you have that huge issue in Romans 5:1, is it let us enjoy peace with God or we have peace with God? There's some theological importance there. I thought about doing something like that. Maybe I will eventually. Maybe a side series or something. So again, all this to say, this doesn't nullify Paul's vision of adoption. It doesn't do that at all. In fact, it's important because he's already developed it earlier. He doesn't really need to come back and talk about it. It just means that his focus here is on what he's intent on emphasizing. It's a continuation of his vision of sonship, or it's just not in the forefront of his mind. In any sense, we do not anticipate adoption because we already possess it like we do the Spirit. But instead we anticipate tain apolutrosin to samatos hemon, the liberation of our bodies. And so Paul's use of apolutrosin in Romans 8:24 speaks to God's lavish act of grace to us in Christ, where liberation is found through his blood. And that's, of course, echoed in Ephesians 1:7, Colossians 1, and Colossians 1:14. This concept of liberation or redemption is woven together with holiness and righteousness in 1 Corinthians 1:30. And this verb is used actually in, I can't remember, I'll say the word. I don't recall if it's a verb or not. I could go check. Word or noun or verb? I had verb originally, so maybe I'll go with verb. I was right. Apolutrosai. That's a future verb. I was right. I love it when I'm right on camera. It rarely happens. So, this verb, make sure I get that right. One for me, is used in Exodus 21:8 in the Septuagint to describe the manumission of a female slave. Instead of the man just selling her off to foreign dignitaries or foreign lands, he has to give her the right of freedom. Josephus uses the noun to refer to ransom money paid to set captives free, and that's Antiquities 12:27. The word denotes independence and liberation from a previous state of existence where the victim is released from bondage. This is slave language. We think of redemption as something, I don't know how we think of redemption language. We use redemption language in a very nebulous way. It's like using the word spiritual or eschatological. It's like, what do we actually mean by spiritual? Well, often I think we mean something like existential, and I think maybe a big part of Christian theology and thinking these things through more is trying to avoid kind of the old way of saying things just simply because we don't know what we're saying. It's like Rawls language and the debate on women in ministry. It's debate on, apostolic authority and the debate between the Roman Catholic Church and Protestants, and so on and so forth. But here, this verb or this word group suggests that the anthropological condition, the state of humanity, the human condition, is fixed upon humanity and creation as a whole as pawns in a massive war. So slaves, often you have what happens, a slave can be part of a family and the slave is passed down like property, when the master dies or the head of the household dies, the slave, and they have kids, it's lines of succession. Other very commonly is war, taking slaves in war. And so here, if that second part is true, then you have this language predicated on the idea of victims of oppression and violence being part of it. And the whole purpose is being set free from this reality. It's basically, we are in a war zone. And the things that are anti-God are not able to survive anymore. So, what is the liberation of our bodies? What is the liberation of our bodies? What does Jesus actually save us from? What is the point of all of this? Very simply put, and I've thought about this verse for a very long time, Jesus saves us from death. The physical reality where our bodies decay and cease, and the supernatural reality where the personified power of death is annulled through resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is our resurrection, our hope that we too shall be delivered from the snares of death. But notice a key point. We aren't liberated from our bodies. Just like Jesus wasn't liberated from his body. Our bodies are the objects of liberation, of emancipation, of freedom, of redemption, if we want to use the word. We aren't going to be bodiless in new creation. We aren't going to be like Casper the Ghost. We aren't immaterial things floating about in new creation. We are given new life, eternal life, life that is generated by the creative power of God's Spirit, who empowers us and sustains us. Resurrection is God's, I think, grand apocalyptic solution to the problem of death. And that is, I think, at the heart of Paul's theology. The resurrection is God's final assault on the ultimate evil enemy, the final hostile power, death itself. And that is what Jesus saves us from. And if Jesus saves us from death, he surely can save us from tribulation, trial, taxes, depression, and anguish. As John Wesley said, quote, from corruption to glory to immortality. And we have a few more verses to go through. For with this hope we were saved, or delivered. For hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what they have not seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we anticipate it because of perseverance, or because of our perseverance. Here, Paul isn't articulating a sightless hope or faith. Hope is not about feeling. It's not about a sensation. It's about a life lived in allegiant love and trust in the righteousness of God, the God who is righteous and acts. Paul points this out insofar as that we were saved is not a deterministic act. It signifies Christians who have actively accepted the Spirit and are putting to death the exploits of the body. It is speaking to a present reality, not a futuristic kind of concretization of eschatological deliverance. We live in anticipation. We live in hope that flows from perseverance. Notice the mechanism. This is placed on us. Our participation with the Spirit is not an assured deterministic model or mode of existence or mode of being. Wesley put it rightly. Quote, we do not yet possess this full salvation. You have been saved, you've been delivered, you've been given the Spirit, you've been given adoption, you've been brought into this new family. And if you continue on with that, if you continue to be led and work with the Spirit, you will be saved. You've been saved and you will be saved. David Garland's point, David Garland's point that, quote, such groaning does not arise from hopelessness, misgivings, or creaturely angst, but from a sure hope that longs to reach the state of perfect redemption. You can tell I've been reading more on entire sanctification because I had perfection redemption, which is a little weird. And I just wrote perfection again. perfect redemption. We possess the Spirit, end quote. We possess the Spirit, but we do not possess complete salvation. We have been saved, and we are going to be fully saved if we persist and participate in the Spirit. And that is something we must long for and live for and ultimately die for. And we might say spirited reciprocity is at the heart of the Holy Spirit and human relationship. In verses 26 and 27, in this same way also, the Spirit supports us in our frailty. For we do not know what we should pray for, but the Spirit itself intercedes with laments that are inexpressible. And the one searching hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes on behalf of the saints in accordance with God. And I think here Paul is at his most pastoral. He understands the degradation. He understands the avarice and the call for submission to foreign powers. He understands the agony of all of this. He understands how all of this stuff works. He understands and he gets it. He's not an abstract theologian. Not even close. I think for Paul, he sees the Spirit as kind of the principal nexus for how God acts. Because the Spirit takes upon itself the force of our words, what we are speaking, what we are thinking, what we are saying, what we are praying, what we are crying. And it speaks them on our behalf, speaks up for us, and intercedes for us. And this happens when we don't even have the words. The Spirit knows, such is the divinity and holiness of the Spirit. The Spirit knows the things that we can't express. And how God searches hearts is a bit ambiguous, but God seems content to test us and to wait for us. God seems very content to do that. And in fact, those who possess the Spirit, who have put to death the exploits of the body or the deeds of the body, who are longing for liberation, have an advocate. We have someone who can speak for us, who can intercede for us, who can cry out when we can't. Our frailties, our weaknesses are taken up by the Spirit, and this is all done in harmony with God, in accordance with what God desires, indicating that reciprocity is also, in some sense, at the heart of the Godhead, the heart of the triune God. At the end of the day, you might say this verse perfectly sums up Romans 5:6. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ died for the ungodly. And so, what now? What is this? What does all of this mean? A famous song by, I believe it's Michael W. Smith, or at least that's who it's attributed to online, and you can trust everything you read online. His glories now we sing, who died and rose on high, who died eternal life to bring, and lives that death may die. And that song is Crown Him with Many Crowns. Although creation is enslaved, God's Spirit lives in us and among us, working to bring us all to glory. This apocalyptic new realm is awaiting a final consummation, but the participation of believers with the Spirit is present, real, and comforting. So for those of us who are struggling, who are anxious, depressed, struggling with or living with afflictions and pain, the word is that the Spirit knows what we need to pray and prays for us and with us. And this is important for how we see Romans 8:28 and following, those who love God. How does God interact with Israel? Those who aren't believing, who aren't interacting, who aren't yielding, who aren't listening. And it brings up the question of God's faithfulness or God's character from someone on the outside looking in. But I think for Paul, because he trusts the Spirit, because he's experienced the risen Christ, his understanding is that at the end of the day, as John Wesley said, and I'm going to butcher the quote because that's what I do live, but I'm not going to butcher it because I'm going to go look for it on my... There it is. The best thing of all is God is with us. The best thing of all is God is with us. And that is what we get to live into every day. And we count it pleasure and joy that we get to suffer on behalf of Christ, because suffering at the end of it produces glory. And that the God who suffered with us, who was crucified and rose, will bring us to glory along with him. And that has massive implications for the church, has massive implications for how we view racial issues and divisions and ethnic conflict in Romans 9, how we view confession and salvation, how we view God's divine activity. But I think we've seen a really interesting kind of groundwork and paradigm for how God acts, how God what God desires, and how God tries to bring things into what he wants, how God kind of interacts in creation, how God views us as creatures. I mean, at the end of the day, Christ died for the ungodly. He didn't wait for us to become righteous. He made us righteous. And now that we have become the righteousness of God through him, our mission is now to actually live into that. And that is participation in Christ. So, cheers to all of you. Thank you for being here. It is probably not my longest video. It certainly feels very long. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all my patrons and friends who have supported this tiny little YouTube channel. Thank you for all who have commented, who were in the live chat commenting. The only way this grows is if people watch and they like it and they share it. So thank you all for doing that, for being here, and for gifting me with your time. I'm very humbled by that. And because of that, I'm taking off the nerdy thing. I'm letting the hair kind of fly. The dude who needs a haircut really, really bad. Good Lord. Yep, I need a haircut so bad. Keep me in your prayers. Still looking for work. A few things might be settling soon. But I have a couple interviews tomorrow with... I'm interviewing a few people tomorrow, theology nerds. I think that'll be fun for the channel. I'm really excited about that. Professor from Truett Seminary, and then a professor from Nazarene Theological Seminary. And then a certain feathery chap mate from a certain college in Melbourne, Australia, has agreed to come on in the next few weeks. So we'll see if this feathery fella can find the time to get on. So a lot more stuff coming on. Looking forward to all of it. Blessed to have all of you here. And may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May his face shine upon you. And may the Spirit empower you as we all go forth and try our best, because sometimes that's all we got, to live into the reality that the God of all creation desires from us. Cheers. God bless. Thanks again, everyone. Water. It's good for you.